was the most spectacular funeral Rome had ever seen. After a long journey from the south, the embalmed body was finally carried past the austere tombs of Rome's noblest conquerors lining the Appian Way just outside the city. It entered through the Capena Gate and passed the Circus Maximus on its way to the Forum. The procession was in the style of a great triumph. All the senators and magistrates in their bright insignia led the procession. Behind them walked the Order of Knights, and after them, a great crowd of tens of thousands of the man's loyal soldiers in their full military gear, bearing new silver shields for the occasion, and holding up the eagle standards which they carried once in the deceased man's countless battles, shining now with a new coating of gold leaf. The matrons of Rome's great families, the surviving ones, contributed 210 huge trays of sweet-smelling spices. Each tray carried on a litter that required 4 men to bear it. And to top it all, through the procession were carried full-sized effigies made entirely of frankincense and cinnamon, first of a lictor, a ceremonial bodyguard carrying one of the rod-axe bundles that symbolized Roman power, the fasces, and then an image of the man himself, Sulla Felix, the Dictator. The entire city was shut down. Never before had so great a throng of commoners come out for any of Rome's spectacles as they did today. The 6,000 busts of noble Romans carried in the array, the 2,000 golden crowns contributed by city-states and kings of the Orient, who the dead man counted as personal friends and clients, the stunning chorus of trumpeters, the horsemen marching in pomp, the spices symbolizing the great wealth of the Orient which he had opened up to Roman trade. It all confirmed the clear message. This was Rome's greatest citizen ever. A young Pompey looked on as they placed the body on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the Forum, and Hortensius, Rome's most renowned orator, began the eulogy. Pompey looked to the assembled priests, the pontifexes, the augurs, the salii, the fetials, the entire college of Roman religious orders, and as he watched, he knew that both they and so many of the senators and dignitaries were not here out of love, but out of fear. Fear, perhaps, of the loyal soldiers and supporters of a dictator who had proscribed thousands. Fear, even it seemed, of the very corpse of Sulla, as if he were still alive and still somehow able to strike them down, even from the grave. It was a gray morning that day in 78 BC, and all through the day, the clouds threatened. After the ceremonies in the Forum, the procession moved out north, out the city gate to the Campus Martius, where a massive funeral pyre had been erected. And as the pyre was lit, the skies thundered. And as the citizens and soldiers passed by to pay their respects, incense wafting around them, it thundered again. And just as the flames finally died down enough, and the men to whom the task had been assigned dutifully collected the dictator's bones for burial, the heavens finally broke, and a thick rain covered the city. As Pompey looked back on that day many years later during his fabulous Eastern campaigns, perhaps he too recalled the cosmic tension in the scene. Sulla's famous luck held out to the end, yes, on this day of his funeral, but only just. Sulla's many detractors who had forcefully opposed the funeral saw bad omens in the thunder and darkness that covered the city and doused the fire, as if the very immortal gods who protected Rome had been divided amongst themselves as to what to do with the man. What would it take to be greater? No, not just greater, but better than Sulla. I'm Alex Petkus. You are listening to The Cost of Glory, where we retell the lives of the greatest Greeks and Romans, following the lead of their classic biographer, Plutarch, to honor them, to learn from their example, and to see if we too might somehow, perhaps, one day, outdo them. This is part 2 of 3 of the life of Pompey the Great. We left off last episode with Pompey winning the political game to secure the command against the corsairs. What stunned people the most about Pompey's pirate campaign was its incredible speed. This had something to do with the fact that Pompey managed to get himself voted astonishing vast resources. At the beginning of his mission, the Senate conceded him 500 ships, 5,000 cavalry, and 120,000 soldiers. But he wouldn't have been able to use these resources effectively if he hadn't also himself been an uncommon administrative genius. Within a mere 6 weeks of starting this war, in 67 BC, Pompey cleared the entire western Mediterranean of sea-bound brigandage. And if you want to know how he did it, he cordoned off land and sea zones and assigned each one of these to 13 legates, one each, subordinate commanders, that is. And their job was to first hunt down any pirates that they sighted, prevent them from leaving their territory, and chase them to shore, ideally, and then send in ground troops to capture them by land as soon as they beached their ships. And, well, within 6 weeks, he's gone and liberated the grain supply of Rome. He's cleared the pirates from all the western Mediterranean, from Corsica, from Sicily, from North Africa. Those are the bread baskets of the city of Rome. And so the wheat ships come rolling in once more, and there's great rejoicing among the plebs. But the thing is, really, clearing the western seas in 6 weeks, you might say, anybody could have done that. The problem was not the western Mediterranean, after all. It was the east. That's where the pirates originated from. It's where their hives were located. And so after his initial progress, Pompey does something very characteristic, and he goes to consult the advice of the wise. Pompey lands his admiral's flotilla on the Greek island of Rhodes, which is off the southwest coast of modern Turkey, and there was a man there that he wanted to consult on that island. And when Pompey arrives, he hears that the man was debating another Greek orator of the day in the city's theater, and so Pompey walks in and he sits down to listen. Posidonius of Rhodes, the Stoic, is now regarded as one of the ancient world's greatest polymaths. Sadly, his works are almost entirely lost, though a number of quotes survive in other ancient authors. And I do hope that the Vesuvius Project will unearth some of his writings, such as his great multi-volume history of this period. Well, Posidonius by now is nearly 70 years old, and he's traveled the world. He's met the long-haired Celts of Gaul. He's seen the cliff towns of North Africa. He's measured the tides on the Atlantic coast of Spain. Posidonius also visited Rome during the reign of Cinna and Marius back in the early 80s. He befriended and taught famous Roman luminaries like Cicero and the Stoic Rutilius Rufus. He has a vast network of the most intelligent and well-connected men in the East. He's got a deep understanding of the political structures, not just of the hundreds of Greek city-states in this region, and their aristocracies and their internal quarrels. But he himself is also a native of the further east, from Apamea in Syria. He knows the complex relations that the Greeks have with the native populations in the hinterlands. Posidonius, like many other Stoics, also has a different perspective on the problem of empire, of what it means to rule not just over your own people, but over others. The Stoics believe that mankind possesses a fundamental brotherhood as common children of nature who endowed humans uniquely with the ability to understand and to exercise the logos, the reason, the logic, the structuring principle of the universe. Because of this foundational brotherhood of humans, the wise man, in their view, should see political and tribal identities which divide us as mere accidents, as epiphenomena, and instead seek to inhabit the cosmos as though it were all a single city, a polis, a cosmopolis, to which every man, free or slave, is a citizen. And the ruler of any empire, especially a world empire, they thought, could gain a special advantage from understanding the true nature of reality and the men who inhabited it. After hearing Posidonius lecture on the finer points of logical method in the theater there, Pompey has a conference with him privately, and he develops his unique signature Eastern pirate strategy. The game plan he develops is diametrically opposed to Sulla's playbook. In fact, it ran completely counter to conventional Roman wisdom, as we'll see. And I think Posidonius read Pompey pretty well, and he figured out the kind of man that he was dealing with. As Pompey is embarking on his ships at the harbor of Rhodes, he turns to the philosopher, and he says, "Any last instructions, my friend?" And Posidonius responds with a line from Homer that sums up the warrior code of the Iliadic heroes. Aien aristewein kai hupeirochon emenai alon. Bravest of all men be, and hold your head high above others. So Pompey begins his massive eastern operations, and he starts capturing a lot of pirate ships. But instead of doing the usual Roman thing of either executing them or selling them into slavery, he talks to them, and he listens to their entreaties for mercy. They have wives, children. As Posidonius surely pointed out to him, there had been great economic and political upheavals in the East in the past 2 decades, and these were men from the kind of stock that in earlier eras had been the leading families of their cities. So Pompey, keeping his other plan in mind, for the most part, he spares them. And as some pirates hear about the example, they start surrendering voluntarily. Some of them he still has to battle down, of course. But what he did next, in the eyes of Posidonius and many contemporary Greek intellectuals, set Pompey apart from so many of the great conquerors of history. And Plutarch sums it up well. Quote, "Reflecting therefore that by nature man neither is nor becomes a wild or an unsocial creature, but is transformed by the unnatural practice of vice, whereas he may be softened by new customs and a change of place in life. Also that even wild beasts put off their fierce and savage ways when they partake of a tamer mode of being. Pompey determined to transfer the men from the sea to the land and let them have a taste of gentle life by being accustomed to dwelling in cities and tilling the ground. Some of them, therefore, were received and incorporated into the small and half-deserted cities of Cilicia, which acquired additional territory. And after restoring the city of Soli, which had been lately devastated by Tigranes, the king of Armenia, and its population transferred to his faraway capital, Pompey settled many there. To many of them he gave as residence Dyme in Achaia, in the Peloponnesus of Greece, which was then bereft of men and had much good land." End quote. And some of these pirates he even settled in some of the more struggling parts of southern Italy, still reeling as it was from the social wars and the slave war with Spartacus. And this was the work not of a kid butcher, but of Pompey, the benevolent, the merciful, the savior, the great. And with that, his pirate work was done, and it was on to the next task. Probably the most impressive thing that Sulla did was, after he went out on his eastern campaigns, he got declared a public enemy by the populist regime in Rome. And despite the fact that the Senate cut off all funding and support and even sent armies out to try to thwart him, Sulla beat incredible odds and defeated King Mithridates of Pontus in a huge war in Greece. But that war ended with a settlement, a peace treaty, in 84. And it wasn't long before the wily king of Pontus was back harassing Roman interests again in Asia Minor. Another of Sulla's protégés, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, was sent with armies in 74 to finish the job. But after some incredible victories against Mithridates and also against his most powerful ally, King Tigranes of Armenia, victories against vastly superior forces, Lucullus discovered that the hardest part of the war was bringing it to a satisfying conclusion, from taking it from 98 to 100. Because at this point, the only thing that would count as victory over Mithridates, in the eyes of the Senate and the Roman people, was the unconditional personal surrender or death of this incredible slippery man. Pompey has in fact been eyeing the situation for years, and many historians suspect his handiwork behind a series of political maneuvers back home, which stripped Lucullus of his resources and limited his legal sphere for action. But then again, Lucullus did have many other independent, powerful political enemies in Rome. But right at the moment that Pompey finished the pirates off, Lucullus was still in command of the Mithridatic War. And that made him the only thing standing between Pompey and a chance to outdo Sulla's greatest achievements which Sulla failed to finish by leaving Mithridates at large. With the stunning news of Pompey's 3-month victory over the pirates rolling into Rome, it's pretty easy for Pompey's friends back home to go to work on the Roman people. And they get a tribune, Manilius, to propose another extraordinary command to the assembled Roman plebs for full control of the war to be handed over to the man who just rescued them from starvation by securing the seas and the grain supply. And the city's rising star orator, Cicero, happens to be praetor for the year, and he delivers a barn burner from the rostra to ecstatic commoners crowding the forum. And the bill, the Lex Manilia, as it was called, it passes in the popular assembly. With the support of a few senators, let's not forget, including, very tellingly, a young Julius Caesar. And so the emissaries arrive at Pompey's base of operations in Cilicia, and they deliver the tidings. "Alas for my endless tasks," Pompey exclaimed in front of them. "How much better it were to be an unknown man, if I am never to cease from military service and cannot lay aside this load of envy and spend my time in the country with my wife." It was far too impolite on that occasion for anyone to smirk or roll their eyes and break the spectacle. But it was clear to all that Pompey finally had what he had long been dreaming about. And his officers were all ready to play their part on this glorious new campaign in the land of the rising sun. Lucullus was about to get some very bad news. The first thing Pompey does is establish his authority in the region. Forcefully. He sends out messages to all of the cities and minor kings that Lucullus has made various arrangements with, things like, exempting this or that city from taxes or punishing it with heavy tributes because of bad behavior or installing this or that king or aristocracy in power. Well, Pompey tells them, that's all invalid now. Pompey is in charge, and you can make your case at his tribunal if you want something. And he also informs the soldiers fighting in Lucullus's army, you have a new general who needs your service. And some of the troops are actually glad about this news. There's been some major mutinies. Someone put it in the soldiers' heads that Lucullus has been screwing them out of their proper plunder and rewards. Pompey, on the other hand, has a reputation for being very good to his soldiers. But, Lucullus by this time is a glorious commander. And, we've talked about his conquests and his character at length in the Lucullus series, episodes 76 through 78. And he's also a proud noble from a blue blood aristocrat family. So you can imagine how he feels about these indignities. And his friends finally arrange an in-person meeting with Pompey in Galatia, which is in central Turkey today. And they, try to reach some kind of an arrangement. And they meet, and there's a famous scene. Now, a Roman commander who's been given the authority, the imperium, to command armies, has bodyguards called lictors. They carry these fasces, these rod axes. And when that commander is victorious, his lictors wreath their fasces in laurels to symbolize that victory. So when they arrive, Pompey's lictors have been traveling through parched and treeless lands, and the wreaths that they've woven and stuck to their fasces, they're dry and scraggly. But Lucullus's wreaths on the lictors' rods, they're lush and verdant because he's in, well-watered areas. And so as a sign of respect, Lucullus has his lictors hand over some of their own lush green laurels to Pompey's men, and they fix them to their fasces. So it's a nice gesture, but the observers later reflected that this seemed to be some kind of a divine sign, that Pompey had in fact come to take from Lucullus the very fruits of his victories, and his glory as well. Pompey was the rising sun here, watching Lucullus as he was setting. And so they have this meeting. The meeting begins amicably enough. The men embrace each other. But as they get to talking, the anger and contempt boil up to the surface. Lucullus charges Pompey with an unruly obsession with power. Pompey counters, and he charges Lucullus with a greedy love of money, sequestering riches from the men who won them for him. Lucullus calls Pompey a lazy carrion bird, a vulture, swooping down and feeding off another man's kill, just like he did with Sertorius, with Lepidus, with Spartacus, whose victories rightly belonged to Metellus, Catullus, and Crassus. And the two start shouting, and eventually their friends have to physically drag them away from each other. So that didn't go well. But it was worse for Lucullus, of course, who soon returns to Rome a defeated man, to be endlessly harassed by his political enemies and prevented from celebrating his rightful triumph until years later. Meanwhile, it was time for Pompey to face Mithridates. In these last few years, as successive jealous politicians back home were gradually stripping poor Lucullus of his powers, King Mithridates has seized back most of his kingdom of Pontus, and he's trained up a formidable veteran army now. And he controls now most of the northern half of Asia Minor. He's based out of his heartland of Pontus, which lies on the southeast Black Sea coast. He's not going to be easy to defeat. And on top of that, Pompey was after a man who was one of history's most determined survivors. Mithridates was not just a great general and a formidable king, he was also a grand master in the arts of medicine and poisoning. For example, as Pompey's army scientists later discovered, there was a special breed of Pontic duck which lived off various poisonous substances. Mithridates would slaughter these poisoned ducks, drain their blood, and mix it into a potion with various herbal antidotes, and he would drink it to fortify himself against chemical warfare from within his own royal household. Mithridates was a master of disguise and subterfuge, too. He'd miraculously slipped away numerous times after his army and camp had been surrounded and defeated. And again, the entire success of Pompey's campaign, right, depends on seizing the body of the king himself, dead or alive. So Pompey gets to work. Pompey begins with a brief diplomatic exchange with Mithridates. He sends to the king to ask him if he's interested in coming to terms. And these are his terms. Mithridates must surrender his person to Pompey, as well as numerous deserters from the Roman units who had now gone over to the side of Pontus in the war. Mithridates sends back, "Over my dead body." And Pompey's actually relieved at this news. Negotiations were, of course, a mere formality. And he promptly marches north and he invades the region of Pontus. He starts capturing citadels. He starts building a string of fortifications. Mithridates gets on the move. They fight a battle in which Pompey wins, but it's inconclusive. Mithridates escapes to an impregnable fortress in the mountains. Pompey surrounds this fort of Mithridates with Mithridates in it. He builds a wall 18 miles long around it to cut off all food and water. Mithridates holds out for 45 days, and then he finally decides to break out with his army. But before he leaves, he kills all the sick and wounded soldiers in his own forces who were in the fort but are unfit to fight. Pompey gives chase. Mithridates sends men out to the countryside to burn all the crops and starve Pompey as he goes. But he doesn't know who he's dealing with. Logistics happens to be Pompey's strongest suit as a commander. Pompey sets up an incredibly long supply chain all the way back to Cilicia, and he keeps the grain coming. The chase goes on, through high mountains, rocky valleys, arid steppes, on and on. Finally, Pompey sees an opportunity. While Mithridates is resting his army one day, Pompey sneaks an infantry detachment 25 miles ahead on a route he knows Mithridates has to take the next day. Mithridates has no idea. He marches on the next day, and he camps for the night. And in the night, a dream appeared to him. Here's Plutarch. He dreamed that he was sailing the Pontic Sea with a fair wind and was already in sight of the Bosporus, and was greeting pleasantly his fellow voyagers as a man would do in his joy over a manifest and sure deliverance. But suddenly he saw himself bereft of all his companions and tossed about on a small piece of wreckage. End quote. As Mithridates is lying there in the middle of the night, his companions burst into his tent and rouse him. Pompey is attacking. Mithridates was camped in a valley, and Pompey's on the heights, and as Pompey's looking down there from the high ground, right before the assault, he wavers for a moment. It's dark. These Parthians know the land. We're outnumbered. Isn't this too risky? But his officers point out to him, no, look now. The full moon is coming out from behind the clouds. And in fact, it was so. The moon was actually going to be at their backs as they charged down the hill, so they would be able to see their enemies quite clearly, enough to do their work. And so Pompey calls for the assault. The Pontic camp wakes up to the deafening blare of Roman trumpets, shouts, and swords clanging on shields. They scramble to their arms just in time to put up a hasty defense. But as the Romans charge, the Parthians can't judge the distance in the darkness, with the moon in their eyes and the Romans casting long shadows out in front of them. Their javelins and arrows and stones are way off. They're ineffective. And the lines clash, and the Roman legions are devastating. And then Mithridates himself sallies out with his elite cavalry, 800 of them, and he breaks through the Roman lines with difficulty. But he soon sees that there's no hope of winning this battle. And he orders his cavalry to wheel around and charge the Roman flank, but he himself slips off with just 3 companions. One of them was a concubine of his, dressed like a Persian soldier. Her name was Hypsicratia. The king always honored her for her extravagant daring. He even called her Hypsicrates, which is a man's name, and she was always by his side on the roughest of his campaigns. Meanwhile, Pompey overruns Mithridates' camp to find the poisoned king has slipped away once again. Mithridates steals away to one of his fortresses. He distributes gold and weapons and costly raiments to his companions, along with a vial of deadly poison for each to carry on their person, in case they should fall into the hands of the Romans against their will. And then he puts on a disguise and he sets off east for Armenia, to his old friend and son-in-law, King Tigranes. Then he sends messengers ahead to ask the king for his protection. But old Tigranes was in his mid-70s by now, and he was tired. Tigranes had gone from being Tigranes the Great, the King of Kings, controlling a huge swath of territory stretching from Cilicia and Antioch to the rich merchant cities of Tyre and Sidon in Phoenicia along the Mediterranean coast, and then all the way to the vassal kings of Media on the Caspian Sea. He'd built Armenia's influence to the greatest extent it ever reached in its history, only to see most of it stripped from him by Lucullus in a Roman blitzkrieg, only to become just Tigranes, just one regional despot among many. All of this for his ill-fated alliance with Mithridates, who was the one who provoked the Romans in the first place. What business did Tigranes have, quarreling with the faraway Romans after all? And he'd recently quarreled with his headstrong son, the ambitious Prince Tigranes the Younger. So much so that his own son had gone over to the Roman side and was now intriguing with the enemy. This son, by the way, was born to Tigranes by his wife, Cleopatra of Pontus, the daughter of Mithridates. So this son of his, Tigranes the Younger, was actually the grandson of Mithridates, which is pretty amazing. And, well, Mithridates is soon shocked to hear that Tigranes has not only arrested the Pontian emissaries, but put a bounty on Mithridates' own head. So no help is coming from Armenia. And so Mithridates, betrayed and deserted by his friends, with enemy spies scouring the land, he slips off to his friends at the kingdom of Caucasus, which is in modern Georgia on the Black Sea coast. Pompey, meanwhile, moves on, and he captures the rest of Mithridates' fortresses in Pontus, and he finds there much to exercise his curious imagination. Plutarch is drawing here on the eyewitness reports of one of the intellectuals Pompey brought along on his campaign, Theophanes, a Greek from Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, who wrote a history of this expedition, which is sadly lost. Now, here's what Plutarch says about what Theophanes was able to gather from the dossier of files they found. In the fortress of Kynum, Pompey also found private documents belonging to Mithridates and read them with no little satisfaction, since they shed much light upon the king's character. For there were memoranda among them from which it was discovered that, besides many others, he had poisoned to death his son Ariarathes, and also Alcaeus of Sardis, because he had surpassed him in driving racehorses. Among the writings were also interpretations of dreams, some of which he himself dreamed, others some of his wives. There were also letters from Queen Monime to the king, of a lascivious nature, and letters from Mithridates answering her in turn." End quote. Queen Monime was dead by now. We narrated her tragic end in the life of Lucullus, Part 2, Episode 77. She was a sophisticated Greek woman of famous beauty from the coastal metropolis of Miletus, and she never got accustomed to the remote isolation of her husband's barbarian domains. When Lucullus captured the fortress that Mithridates was hiding her in, together with his other wives, the king sent instructions that they were to commit suicide, and he sent one of his eunuchs to make sure the task got done. And like the rest of his fierce queens, Monime obeyed her orders. So Mithridates escaped once again, and maybe you could have predicted this. But lucky for Pompey, capturing Mithridates wasn't his only mandate. By the letter of the Lex Manilia, which his buddies had passed in Rome, Pompey was also charged with finishing the war that Lucullus had started with Tigranes. In recent years, Tigranes of Armenia had forcefully captured back some of his old lands in Cappadocia from the Romans, so he had to answer for this, didn't he? Well, Pompey invites Prince Tigranes the Younger, who's now in his camp, to lead the Romans into the territory of his father the king. And I think that one of Pompey's great advantages in subduing the East is that he had a lot of sympathy for these regional kings. He understood what a hard place Tigranes must have been in, emotionally, politically. And here's what he does. He invades the territory of Tigranes, and he camps outside the ancient Armenian capital of Artaxata, which is near Yerevan today. It's in the shadow of Mount Ararat. And he receives emissaries from the king, surrendering and inviting Pompey to send a garrison of Roman soldiers into the royal palace. Then the king himself rides up to the Roman camp with his ministers, and Plutarch tells the story of what happened. When Tigranes rode up to the Roman camp, 2 of Pompey's lictors came to him and bade him dismount from his horse and go on foot, for no man mounted on horseback had ever been seen in a Roman camp. Tigranes accordingly not only obeyed them in this, but also unloosed his sword and handed it to them. And finally, when he came into the presence of Pompey himself, he took off his royal tiara and made as if to lay it at his feet. And what was most humiliating of all, he would have thrown himself down and clasped Pompey's knees in supplication. But before he could do this, Pompey leapt up and caught him by the hand, drew him up, and led him to his consular throne. He gave the king a seat near himself and put the king's son on the other side." End quote. Pompey tells King Tigranes, "You should lay the blame for the loss of your empire on Lucullus, who robbed you of Syria, Phoenicia, Cilicia, Galatia, and Sophene. There's nothing I can do about that. But if you agree to an indemnity of 6,000 talents, that's a huge sum of money, then the Roman people will forgive you and allow you to keep the lands of your ancestral kingdom, which you currently hold." So Tigranes is going to keep kind of the heartland of native Armenia. And Tigranes agrees, And then Pompey invites his soldiers to hail Tigranes as king of Armenia. Tigranes, thinking he was going to lose everything, he's overcome and he weeps with joy. And then he shouts out that he promises to give each soldier half a mina of silver, which is several weeks' pay, and each centurion 10 minas, and each tribune a talent. And then Pompey promises Tigranes' son the rulership of the kingdom of Sophene, which is a smallish yet not altogether unproductive rump of territory in what's now southeast Turkey. But the grandson of Mithridates was not satisfied by this because he wanted the whole kingdom for himself. Afterwards, Pompey invites him to dinner, but Tigranes Jr. refuses, and he mutters, "I don't need Pompey to get my kingdom. I can just bribe some other Roman to give me my rightful honors." And so Pompey has him arrested and thrown in chains and saves him to parade later through the streets of Rome in his triumph. So Tigranes the Great becomes one of Rome's many client kings. And this was an arrangement that Pompey went on to exploit with great effect, greater than any Roman before him, really. Rome had many provinces, several in Asia Minor now. Cilicia, which is in the armpit of the peninsula, it's southern Turkey. They've also got Bithynia, which is northwest Turkey. It's on the Asian side of the Bosphorus Straits. And then they've also got Asia proper, which is the Aegean coastline and its hinterlands. But maintaining a province is expensive and it's politically complicated. You need a governor who is a short-term political appointee, and he's got to have a staff, he's got to administer justice, hold the assizes, which is the traveling court, and you've got to collect taxes, and the provincials hate you for collecting taxes. Especially, they hate the equestrian business syndicates who the Roman government hires this work out to, the publicans. The abuses are hard to rein in. A client king, though, is theoretically just your ally, and he pays you some kind of tribute, typically less than the tax revenue, but you let him be, and to his people, he's the king. You might say it's a lower reward than controlling a province, but it's also far lower risk, and especially with these far-flung regions, it made a lot of sense. And a client was theoretically a client of the SPQR, the Senatus Populumque Romanum, the Roman people. But if you're Pompey and that king really owes you his throne, well, he's your client in practice. For example, did Tigranes have the cash on hand to pay his massive 6,000 talent indemnity? No? Well, no problem. Pompey can finance that for him. He carries the note, and he personally collects 12% interest on it while Tigranes pays the debt down. Tigranes gets to keep his throne, and if, say, the Parthians to the south should try to pick on him, well, Tigranes can call on his connections at the SPQR to come in and regulate. Everybody wins. In fact, it was in his peacetime arrangements that Pompey really shone the brightest of all. He traveled around to the various war-torn cities in the new Roman provinces of Bithynia, Cilicia, and Pontus too, and as acting governor, he heard countless pleas of town councils, guilds, local potentates, and individuals in need. He set up a flexible, sensitive, durable administrative system that would last. For example, he set up a distinction between local laws and customs, which he left in place, as regards all matters of civil dispute, to be decided on locally by locally elected leaders, and on the other hand, a higher system of Roman courts for issues regarding Roman provincial law, for tax disputes, for criminal and constitutional matters, and the Roman provincial governor was the final court of appeal. And he sets fair tax rates, repairs temples, reconciles quarreling parties. Pompey wants Rome not to be a colonialist abuser, but a keeper of peace and a bringer of justice to lands that have been suffering from decades of war and imperial extortion. He wants to lay down an arrangement such that the provincials, at least their ruling classes, don't just tolerate Roman rule, but actively court it, desire it. And it was at some point around this time that Pompey recognized he had a special kinship with the goddess Venus, the Greek Aphrodite, the goddess of love, of desire, of beauty and charm. Venus was the ancestral goddess of the Roman people. She was the ancient protector of Troy, who saved the legendary hero Aeneas from the Greek fires that destroyed that city. Aeneas carried the cult of Venus all the way to Italy, as the poet Virgil tells us. Troy was now a town in the Roman province of Bithynia. Rome was now entering into her destiny as a benevolent lord of these ancient lands. Pompey was entering his destiny as a reconciler of civilized and savage, of Greek and barbarian, as his boyhood hero Alexander the Great had once done. But Pompey's Eastern Empire would not fall apart into quarreling rival kingdoms immediately after his death, as Alexander's had. For that story, listen to the life of Eumenes that we did in episodes 7 through 9. Pompey wanted Rome's empire to last for centuries, and indeed it did, on the model that he first laid down in these lands. Altogether, Pompey ends up founding 39 cities in the East. And for now, let's put aside the fact that this was irregular, to say the least. These sort of foreign relations arrangements were usually made by multi-person, specially appointed senatorial commissions. But Pompey was better informed about local affairs than any ad hoc commissioner would be. And wasn't what Pompey was doing more efficient than decision-making by committee? And anyway, he fully intended to get all of his decrees ratified by the Senate eventually, and surely that could all be sorted out rather easily once he got home. Well, in the meantime, Mithridates was still at large. Pompey turns north to chase him. And I think it's worth mentioning some of the names of these people and places just to give you a scope of how crazy Pompey's expedition is. So straight north of Armenia is the Caucasus, that mountainous land bridge between the Black Sea to its west and the Caspian Sea to its east. Mithridates was reported to be on the Black Sea side, on the foot of the Caucasus on the west in Colchis, this wide plain in Georgia today, modern Georgia. The Black Sea, by the way, is often called the Pontic Sea, or even more commonly in Greek, it's called the Euxine Sea, which means the friendly or the neighborly sea. It's just one of these times when the name intentionally means the opposite of the truth. It was ringed by hostile barbarian tribes, and so the Colchians were one of these tribes that Mithridates has befriended. So Mithridates is there on the west, but whether it was because an alternate route offered easier terrain, or whether it was the case, as Plutarch suggests, that Pompey was partly inspired by a desire to see how far east he could go, Pompey takes a circuitous route through the other foot of the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea side to the east, the modern Azerbaijan side, which is the land of another hostile barbarian tribe called the Albani. And these, by the way, have no relation with the Balkan Albanians that we know today. And Pompey tries to make his way through nicely, but, these were Mithridates' friends, and so they try to attack him. He has to smash his way through with great violence, but then he wheels around toward his ultimate goal, and he moves westward, and he goes through the land of the Iberians. And again, confusingly, these people have no relation with the Iberians of Spain. These people are in what's today Georgia. And these guys, too, put up a fight, and they lose. And thus Pompey makes it at last to Colchis on the Black Sea coast, only to find that Mithridates has already fled north. He's picking his way along through the mountain tribes, along the Black Sea coast. He's hoping to reach his son, who rules an area called the Bosporan Kingdom, which is a Greco-Scythian principality centered around the Crimea and the Sea of Azov. And I think it's difficult for a modern person to appreciate just how far Pompey was from Rome at this point, not just physically, but culturally. The Crimea, where Mithridates was headed, It was the land of the wild Taurians. The ancient Greeks believed that the Taurians practiced human sacrifice, as seen in Euripides' play Iphigenia among the Taurians. Well, Pompey never got quite there, but right now, in Caucasus, he himself is standing in what were believed to be the ancestral domains of the mythic king Aeetes of Caucasus, where Jason and the Argonauts once traveled to seek the Golden Fleece, and where they found the enchanting witch Medea, the king's daughter, and Jason stole her back to Greece. And somewhere up in the towering fastness of the Caucasus Mountains, higher than any mountains in Europe, that was where Zeus nailed the god Prometheus to have his liver eaten continually by giant birds in punishment for bestowing the gift of fire to mankind. So, should Pompey keep chasing Mithridates? Well, he has it on good authority that relations between Mithridates and his son, who rules the land of the Taurians, that they were strained, to say the least. And every now and then, the best way to solve a problem is to simply ignore it and focus on more interesting things. And there was so much to fascinate a man of great spirit in these strange territories at what was, for the Greeks and the Romans, the edge of the known world. But something always comes up whenever you're trying to sightsee as a general. Pompey soon gets word that the Albanians back east have revolted against a commander that he left in place to pacify them. So he resupplies from his Roman ships at the Greek port of Phasis, and he heads back east to do battle. On his way, a detachment of several hundred of his men wander into the forest looking for supplies, and they conveniently find a great stash of honey jars. And they eat the honey, but it's a trap that the locals have set. The men experience horrific hallucinations, and they get disoriented. And at the height of their bad trip, the natives swoop in on these poor men and they cut them down. This actually can happen with honey if the bees pollinate at the right kind of plants. And you can compare the famous toxic honey scene from Xenophon's Anabasis, Book 4, which we saw back in episode 57. Well, Pompey reaches the Albanians at last, and he fights a great battle against 60,000 foot soldiers and 12,000 horsemen, clad with the skins of wild beasts. He engages the brother of the Albanian king in hand-to-hand combat. The brother of the king strikes him with a javelin on the fold of his breastplate, but Pompey runs him through and kills him. And then the Romans win in a great slaughter. And it is said, I suspect by the excitable Theophanes of Mytilene, that the fabled Amazons came down from their wild domains around the river Thermodon to fight on the Albanian side in this great battle. For the Romans despoiling the corpses afterwards found Amazonian shields and boots. But no physical body of any of these mighty warrior women were ever found. I guess their corpses just vanished. Pompey wanted to take his grand expedition all the way to the Caspian Sea, which was only 3 days' march to the east. But, disappointingly, according to Plutarch, he was forced to turn back by a great multitude of deadly poisonous reptiles. That was a good one for the camp botanists. And anyway, Pompey has his eyes on another exotic body of water, temptingly lapping a coast beyond the limit any Roman commander has ever led an army. This time, it's the Red Sea to the south. And he has a great excuse to forge his way there. Before Tigranes the Great built Armenia into a short-lived great power, that kingdom had been a vassal state to the mighty Parthian Empire, which is a Persianate dynasty which controls a huge swath of territory stretching from Iraq and Persia all the way to Afghanistan. And the Parthians have been relatively quiet lately because they've been embroiled in a bloody internal conflict of their own. But the great king of kings, Phraates of Parthia, is now emerging from it with confidence. And the Parthians have always had their eye on Syria and the rich coastal cities of Phoenicia and the Levant. It would be great business for them to control the Silk Road ports on the Mediterranean coast. And they've made some military expeditions there. So, clearly, they were a threat. What Armenia needed, nay, what Rome needed, was a buffer zone, something that could protect Cilicia and Cappadocia too. Well, Syria was a rump state now, ruled by an impotent descendant of the once mighty Seleucid Greek dynasty. And to make a long story short, Pompey deposes Antiochus XIII, who is a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, and he ends the dynasty at last. And he declares, since the land has no legitimate ruler, that Syria is now a Roman province. This was just too easy. Now, while Pompey is resting in Damascus, in Syria, hearing court cases, arranging the complex affairs of Rome's new eastern province, he makes a fateful world historical move that would have unimaginable consequences in a future that he would not live to see. He gets some news that makes him decide to turn his friendly gaze toward another odd little state, a state long a plaything of the great powers in its neighborhood, which somehow, despite the odds, had managed to carve out a relative independence for itself: Judea. There was a civil war for the throne between the two brothers of the Jewish royal family. In fact, one of Pompey's legates, Aemilius Scaurus, already intervened in this quarrel the year before, and he ruled in favor of the younger and more energetic of the two sons, Aristobulus, and he was now on the throne in Jerusalem, their capital. But after this, the older brother, Hyrcanus, fled to the powerful Nabatean Arab tribes. This is a group of nomads who ranged freely across the desert crescent, all the way from the Euphrates to the Red Sea. They control the trade routes. They conduct raids on the settled populations. Well, the king of these Nabatean tribes, Aretas, decided to march on Jerusalem with 50,000 men to reinstall Hyrcanus against the wishes of Rome. But then Pompey's man Scaurus marched his legions south, and the Arabs backed down. Now, though, the two brothers are quarreling again, and they come to Pompey to resolve their dispute. Pompey sees another opportunity here. He rules this time in favor of the older, more pliant brother, Hyrcanus. And it's a story for another day, but Hyrcanus was really a sort of a puppet for another Jewish noble who was actually the father of the famous, later, King Herod the Great, who appears in the Bible. But let's not get off track. Now, Pompey sees here that the real threat is not the Jews, but the Nabatean Arabs, who have an excellent track record of successful raids against Syria, and that's now, of course, a very high-priority Roman interest. So he marches down the Jordan Valley to the Nabatean capital, to the famous desert metropolis of Petra, which is now in modern Jordan. It was a show of force to demonstrate who the new boss was in these territories. And it seems that the Arabs decided not to argue, and they faded into the deserts. And so Pompey added to his list of new Roman clients yet another people, the Arabs, and thus he extended the Roman sphere of influence all the way, at last, to the Red Sea. The younger brother of the two claimants to the throne of Judea, Aristobulus, he's furious at the fact that the Romans betrayed him and abandoned their original agreement, and he complains to Pompey, but Pompey won't be swayed. He has his reasons. And at last, Aristobulus sees there's nothing he can do about the situation, so he surrenders himself to the Romans. And he promises Pompey the city of Jerusalem will surrender too. Yes, on my orders they will surrender, he assures Pompey. And Aristobulus promises also that he will deliver to the Romans a great sum of money out of the Jerusalem temple treasury. And Pompey, thinking that this deal was as good as done, he sends his friend Gabinius ahead. This is the same Gabinius that proposed the law granting that command against the pirates. So off goes Gabinius with a small garrison. He's thinking he'll take possession of the city and the funds, no big deal. And Pompey slowly marches west to follow. But while he's camped at the ancient city of Jericho by the shore of the Dead Sea, he gets some news. Here's Plutarch. Pompey had already pitched his camp for that day and was exercising himself on horseback nearby when dispatch bearers rode up from Pontus, bringing good tidings. Such messengers are known at once by the tips of their spears, which are wreathed in laurel. As soon as the soldiers saw these couriers, they ran in throngs to Pompey. At first he was disposed to finish his exercise, but at their shouts and entreaties, he dismounted from his horse, took the dispatches, and led the way into the camp. There was no regular tribunal, nor had there been time to erect the military substitute which the soldiers make with their own hands by digging up large clods of earth and heaping them on one another. But in the eager haste of the moment they piled up the pack saddles of the beasts of burden and made an eminence of them. Pompey ascended this and announced to his soldiers that Mithridates was dead. He had done away with himself because his son Phraates had come into possession of all the power there, acting, as he wrote, on behalf of himself and the Romans. Phraates, we are to understand, wrote the letter that Pompey was reading. Upon this, the army, filled with joy, as was natural, gave itself up to sacrifices and entertainments, feeling that in the person of Mithridates, 10,000 enemies had died. End quote. When Mithridates arrived in the Crimean kingdom, it turns out he found his son unwilling to carry on war with the Romans. So he warred against him, his own son, and he won. But after having murdered his other two sons already, he decided to spare Phraates. But then his son engineered a palace coup, and Mithridates, at last, 68 years old, deserted by his friends and family, all his hopes of winning back his kingdom dashed, preferred death to the prospect of being captured and marched through the streets of Rome in some triumphal procession. So he offered the two daughters who had stood by his side to the end their own lethal doses of poison, so they could die in a manner befitting their honor, and he drank his own dose with them. But in his own case, he found that his years of building up tolerance had paid off all too well, and the poison was ineffectual. So he had one of his trusted officers run him through with a sword. So perished Rome's greatest foe since Hannibal, the man who haunted their eastern borders and their nightmares for 25 years, who held out against 2 generations of Rome's greatest generals. Some he eluded, many he defeated in battle. Others he executed publicly by pouring gold down their throats. Pompey makes a generous peace with Phraates, the son, and he orders Mithridates' body to be conveyed to the burial grounds of the Pontic kings at Sinope on the Black Sea to be interred there with due honors. With Mithridates dead, Pompey has indisputably outdone Sulla's legacy of conquests. The war is over, and Pompey doesn't have any more legal grounds to prolong this empire building in the east. But before long, Gabinius gets back with some unfortunate news. The Jewish nobles of Jerusalem and the priestly aristocracy who have been backing Aristobulus against his brother stopped Gabinius on his way to the city. Gabinius handed them the letter from Aristobulus, ordering them to surrender the city. And they said, okay, give us some time. And then they rushed back into Jerusalem and they seized the great temple, and they cut off the bridge that connected it to the rest of the city, making it a great fortress. The men in the city proper are from the other faction. They desperately welcome in the Romans. They're hoping to avoid bloodshed. And it works out well for them. But you can't control a city without controlling its citadel. So Pompey marches in and he draws up his full army. The Romans occupy the city and they try one more time to offer conciliatory terms to the Jews in the temple. No dice. Pompey brings the full might of Roman engineering against them. He starts cutting down trees and heaping wood and earth into a huge ravine on the north side of the temple. He rolls up siege towers and catapults all the way from the city of Tyre, and he begins battering the walls with missiles. And the ancient Jewish historian Josephus records what happened next. And had it not been our practice from the days of our forefathers to rest on the 7th days, this bank could never have been completed, because the Jews would have prevented it. For though our law permits us to defend ourselves against those who initiate hostilities on those days, it does not permit us to meddle with our enemies while they do anything else. This fact the Romans understood well. And so, on those days which we call Sabbaths, they did not shoot at the Jews, nor meet them in hand-to-hand combat, but instead raised up their earthen banks and brought their siege engines into readiness, that they might be put to work on the next day. And one can get an idea of the extreme piety which we show toward God and of our strict observance of the law from the fact that during the siege the priests were not hindered from performing a single sacred ceremony through fear, but twice a day in the morning and at the 9th hour they performed the sacred ceremonies at the altar and did not omit any of the sacrifices, even when some difficulty arose because of the attacks. And indeed, when the city was taken in the month of June, on the Sabbath day, in the consulship of Gaius Antonius and Marcus Tullius Cicero, the year was 63 BC, and the enemy rushed in and were slaughtering the Jews in the temple, those who were busied with the sacrifices nonetheless continued to perform the rites, nor were they compelled either by fear for their own lives or by the great number of those already slain to run away, but thought it better to endure whatever they might have to suffer there by the very altar, rather than neglect any of the divine ordinances." End quote. The first Roman to ascend the wall was the young 23-year-old Faustus Sulla, son of the great Dictator. Pompey took him on the Eastern campaign with him, and later gave him his own daughter in marriage. Inside the temple grounds, there was untold slaughter everywhere. Some were killed by the Romans, others killed by the Jews of the other faction, the ones who let the Romans into Jerusalem. Others dashed themselves down the walls onto the rocks below, and those who survived went and burned themselves alive in their own houses. It was the first taste the Romans got of that legendary intensity of the Jewish zealots, and far from the last. 12,000 Jews died. Pompey himself committed a grave sacrilege in their eyes by personally entering the Holy of Holies in the temple, the first Roman to do so. But a Roman thought it strange that it be considered unlawful to look upon the holy possessions of a god by whose help and clear favor in their eyes they had conquered the city, and now become the stewards of his worship. Pompey gazed upon the golden table and the sacred menorah, and the libation vessels and the great quantity of spices. He said a prayer of thanksgiving, and he touched none of the objects. And in doing all this, he believed he was acting in accordance with the full extent of piety, in a manner worthy of his virtuous character, thinking that this god, too, could become a protector of Rome. The following day, he instructs the temple servants to cleanse the holy places and offer their customary sacrifices to God, and he installs the brother of Aristobulus, his man Hyrcanus, as the new high priest of the Judeans. He did, of course, help himself to the Jews' vast treasure of riches which they stored in the temple treasury, including 10,000 talents, which would, of course, aid the Romans in various necessary peacekeeping operations. But Pompey managed to resist the greatest temptation of all, to help himself to easy plunder. Now that he was on the doorstep of by far the greatest prize in the Mediterranean, not Judea, but neighboring Egypt. King Ptolemy XII, Ptolemy the Piper, an avowed friend of the Roman people, he sent him a very interesting message while he was there about how Ptolemy could use Pompey's help in suppressing riots or something in Alexandria. It was a clear invitation to intervene and prop up the king's unstable rule. The treasures of millennia of pharaohs beckoned to the Romans with dreams of untold wealth. But Pompey would be blatantly overstepping his mandate, and he's already provoked enough jealousy among the Senate to last him a lifetime. He would eventually come to Egypt, though in very different circumstances. In fact, it would become his final resting place. But that was much later. Pompey starts the army on its long journey home, back up north the way he came and out west through Asia. And on his way, he stops by Rhodes again, hoping to listen to his friend Posidonius deliver another wise discourse. But he hears that the old Stoic was sick in bed with intense pain from a severe attack of gout. He visits the philosopher at his home and he offers his respects, and he expresses regrets that he won't be able to hear the man lecture. Posidonius turns to him and says, "Nonsense. Never would I allow a little pain to make a man of your eminence visit me for nothing." And the old man props himself up in bed and he delivers a message. And Pompey used to recount to his friends what Posidonius said to him on that occasion. Posidonius delivered his message with some urgency, as if he were seeing Pompey for the last time and entrusting to him some precious talisman. "Pompey," he said, "never forget, there is nothing in the world that is good, except what is honorable." And he went on to explain the ancient Stoics' philosophical reasoning behind this. And while he spoke, Posidonius would occasionally wince uncontrollably from the extreme pains of agony in his joints. And then he'd laugh and address his own suffering like a debate partner. And he'd say, "Ah, pain, for all the distress you cause, I shall never admit that you are an evil." Perhaps Posidonius realized Pompey was going to need all the moral fortification he could get for what was coming. As Pompey makes his way back to Italy, it's the year 62, he has two big objectives in mind. First is, he's got to get all of his arrangements in the East legally ratified in Rome. All the client king appointments, the tax arrangements, the new provinces, everything. It's both the centerpiece of his long-term legacy and the basis of most of the wealth and prestige he hopes to be able to wield once he gets back home. Second, he's got tens of thousands of troops who are now counting on their reward for their years of service. Many of these guys signed on as poor provincials, many of them destitute from the ravages of the civil wars. Of course, they've already gotten loads of pay and plunder, but like Marius and Sulla before him, Pompey has promised to make these men gentlemen, honorable. And for that, they're going to need land, which is the only way to get permanent generational wealth that levels you up in society, and your descendants too. These guys are counting on him. The senators at Rome, though, especially the proud Optimate nobles, they can do a whole lot to make this very difficult if they want to. And in the complex world of Roman politics, Pompey's great strengths in battle tactics and military logistics are no use. And his great conqueror prestige is as likely to be a disadvantage because of the jealousy it provokes when such a man tries to throw his weight around in hotly contested domestic affairs. And there's an initial bad sign as Pompey is approaching. His old buddy Crassus, partner in the consulship from the year 70, also his greatest rival in politics, Crassus ostentatiously flees Italy before Pompey arrives, and he takes his sons with him. He's trying to liken Pompey's return to the vengeful return of Sulla, and everybody remembers how that went. And Pompey does have numerous vocal political enemies back home, so, this was not entirely implausible. Well, Pompey counters this by disbanding his army as soon as he arrives. He sends all the men back to their homes as soon as he sets foot in Italy. Pompey's no Sulla. He's been a bringer of peace and justice in the East, and he wants to continue that pattern in Rome. And as he marches on foot to Rome with only a small retinue, crowds come out to meet him as he moves from town to town to see the glorious conqueror return. He's admired, he's feted. Things seem to be going well. Next, he begins a campaign to court the aristocracy, and he's done so many of the right things. He's brought many of the sons of the old families with him on the campaign, people like the son of Aemilius Scaurus, who was the greatest figure in the Senate in the 80s, Faustus, the son of Sulla. Metellus Celer was his lieutenant in conquering the Albanians. And Metellus' brother, Nepos, was on the campaign too. These are scions of the great Mytilene clan, the most powerful political family in Rome. Early on in his adventures, Pompey also went out of the way to honor Marcus Cato, the famous Cato the Younger, who visited him at Ephesus. Pompey jumped out of his chair to go and embrace him when Cato walked into the room. In fact, now that he's back, he has his eye particularly on young Cato. As he's starting to already pick up some signs of resistance to his political program from the Senate, he tries something bold. He divorces his wife, who, let's point out, she had a reputation for being unfaithful while he was away, and he approaches Cato with a proposal. Cato has 2 marriageable nieces, and Pompey would like to marry the elder niece, and Pompey's son would like to propose to the younger. But Cato refuses. His nieces are shocked. "Don't you realize that we could have been married to the greatest man in Rome and his son? What are you thinking?" And Cato famously replied, "Cato is not to be captured via the women's quarters." And this was incredibly embarrassing. And it turned out to be an even bigger miscalculation on Pompey's part, because his now ex-wife, Mucia, was related to the proud Mytilene. She was a stepsister or a half-sister or something. And to be fair, Metellus Nepos had come home to be a tribune of the plebs the year before, and he'd kind of been a brazen idiot, and I'll save the details for the life of Cato the Younger. But while Metellus Nepos was trying to work in Pompey's interests back home in Rome when Pompey was off east, Nepos had alienated many of the Optimate nobles by kind of using the populist playbook. So maybe you could argue that Pompey was trying to distance himself from these new apparent outliers in the Optimate oligarchy. But once Pompey divorced their sister, it became an issue of family honor, and the Mytilene patched things up with the other noble families, and they declare Pompey their sworn enemy. So Pompey remains a bachelor. Politics, it turns out, like love, was orders of magnitude more complicated than war. And now as he gets going in politics, anytime in the Senate the issue of land grants to Pompey's veterans is brought up, or the question of the eastern settlement, Pompey's enemies make violent speeches against them. The Optimate commander Lucullus, who Pompey disgraced by stealing the war with Mithridates, so the line went, Lucullus proposes that the Senate really needs to examine every single point of Pompey's eastern settlement and vote on them separately to make sure that every item was really in the best interests of the Roman people. And many gray heads nod. Wise course, yes. It was procedural obstructionism at its most devious, a plan to drag out the ratification interminably and make it all but impossible. Well, Pompey uses his popular support and the voting bloc of his veterans to get some of his buddies elected to the consulship. But these outsider career soldiers, they're even more useless than Pompey himself on the home front. Pompey tries to patch things up with Cicero. Cicero, after being a wild card earlier there in the 60s, he supported Pompey's extraordinary commands against Mithridates and Tigranes and the pirates. Well, Cicero, he'd worked his way up, and he'd finally succeeded in becoming a serious figure in the Optimate oligarchy. He got elected consul in 63. He'd put down an attempted populist coup by Catiline. See episodes 66 to 68 that we did on Catiline. Cicero was a new man, a confident one. And relations had kind of cooled between the two for this reason. So Cicero's not exactly tooting Pompey's horn either. And Pompey starts to think, hey, maybe he doesn't need the old farts in the Senate. He can appeal to the people directly and put some pressure on the old men. But as Cicero recalled after seeing Pompey make a public speech in front of the assembly, a contio, Pompey was actually not that good at courting the mob. His speech held out no comfort for the poor, no hopes for the revolutionaries, nor was there anything in it to impress the Optimates. It was a total flop, Cicero wrote. Pompey was seeing that while he tried to stand on both stools, the popular one and the noble one, he managed to fall through straight down the middle. He was getting isolated. So he started sitting next to Cicero in the Senate, inviting him to dinner, Pompey was a law and order man, after all. Good governance was important to him. Nothing is good except what's honorable. Cicero liked all of this, and soon their excellent friendship was, Cicero recalled, the talk of the town once again. But would it be enough? The younger, fashionable set of new populist politicians, men in particular like Clodius Pulcher, are starting to smell blood in the water. They start ridiculing Pompey in public speeches. This was even more disturbing than the opposition from the nobles. Pompey wanted to be a law and order man, to put all that tribune-engineered, plebiscite, ramrod, constitution overriding stuff of his early career behind him, if he could. But it was nice to have a plan B. Yet if Pompey couldn't even hope to court the mob, he was in danger of getting robbed even of his nuclear options. He was only 45 years old. He was in the prime of his life, the height of his powers. Why was this all so hard? And so, in his frustration, he starts backing off and getting despondent. Cicero recalled going out to visit Pompey one day and finding the conqueror of Asia sitting alone in a room in his house, staring quietly at the treasures of his victories, hoping somehow the winds would shift, but realizing there was little he could do to change them. Pompey consoles himself by building an elaborate, glorious mansion in the Alban Hills, a day's journey from Rome, overlooking the great Alban Lake to the southeast of the city. Not a mansion, but a mighty palace, really. Something that could remind him that, for all that he was the butt of jokes and the punching bag of every class in Rome, to the great, rich, ancient, cultured lands of the East, to somebody, he was still a glorious, even a monarchical figure. His villa's gardens would be inspired by the great paradisoi, the paradise parks of the Oriental kings. He invites great architects, artists, poets, writers to come out and visit him. He collects busts, paintings, statues, fine tapestries, fills the house with gold couches and tables and cabinets, the gifts of great dynasts, faraway friends of his. And you can visit the ruins of his Alban villa even today. And Pompey also received great consolation from finally celebrating his triumph in the year 61. All this time he's been waiting outside the Pomerium, the official sacred limits of the inner city of Rome. Pompey enters the heart of the city at last in powerful splendor, the greatest triumph Rome had ever seen. The city shut down for 2 whole days to accommodate the full length of the procession. He had captives from all the nations he had conquered: Asia, Pontus, Armenia, Paphlagonia, Cappadocia, Cilicia, Syria, the Scythians, the Jews, the Albanians, the Iberians, the Bastarnae of Thrace, the inhabitants of the island of Crete. And they were not chained up like prisoners, but walking free and imposing in their finest native costumes. 700 ships that he captured were brought into Rome's harbors. He processed the war beaks of many of their prows before the gawking plebs. There were 2 carriages stuffed with legendary objects: the golden couch of Darius the Great, father of Xerxes, king of Persia, the throne scepter of Mithridates himself, and a graven image of that king, 8 cubits high, made of solid gold. There were countless wagons porting 75 million drachmas of silver coin, leaking souvenirs for the poor with a jingle as they hit the bumps in the street. And there, riding in a chariot studded with gems, was the conqueror himself, celebrating his victory over a 3rd continent now, the only Roman ever to do so, his face painted red, wearing, it is said, as the ancient historian Appian remarks, the cloak of Alexander the Great, if anyone can believe that. But Pompey believed it, and that was what counted. He actually found that relic of his boyhood hero among the possessions of Mithridates. And Pompey marched before them great kings and chieftains, Olthakes of the Colchians, 5 sons of Mithridates, the wild queens of the Scythians, 3 chiefs of the Iberians, 2 Albanians, and of course, the disgruntled Tigranes the Younger of Armenia and Aristobulus of the Jews. As was custom, these enemy chieftains were paraded up onto the rostra to have their throats cut and their blood bless and glorify the civic altar. But at the last minute, Pompey pardoned them all and sent them all home at public expense as the crowds roared in approval. His empire would not be an empire of reprisals, but of desire, love even. It was a celebration no one would forget. But after the crowd's exultant cheers died down and their hangovers passed, Pompey discovered, for all his weighty majesty, the Roman masses still weren't his. Pompey, though, had another plan in mind that was going to make them happy, a great building project. More on that later. But even this was going to take a lot of time, and the patience of Pompey's soldiers and his eastern clients was starting to wear thin. In his desperation, he gets a populist tribune friend of his to try to push through a land bill for his veterans. But Metellus Celer is one of the consuls now, and in the Senate House he shouts Pompey's tribune down. The tribune has the consul arrested and hauled off to prison. They can do that. But then Metellus summons the Senate, and they come to the very prison house to hear him continue his filibuster. Pompey sighs and backs down. He's not even sure the assembly would ratify the bill at this point, so low have his popular fortunes sunk. But when all hope seemed lost, the winds did change at last. The young Julius Caesar was back in town, returning from a tour of duty as governor of Spain. Caesar approaches Pompey with a fateful deal. Even though Caesar is from one of Rome's oldest families, one that claimed descent from Venus in fact, he's built his career up to this point as an antagonist of the Optimates. He supported Pompey's radical, extraordinary Eastern Command bills. Caesar has also managed to cultivate the strongest populist constituency Rome has seen since the days of Gaius Marius and Cinna. Caesar also enjoys the full backing of Rome's single most powerful politician, old Marcus Crassus. Crassus, back now from the escape that he feigned earlier, he's been a secret thorn in Pompey's side this whole time, whispering into the ears of mid-ranking senators, scheming to sway both the Optimates and the mob against him to keep him in check. Pompey just knows it. But Caesar calls a secret meeting between the three of them, perhaps in Crassus's modest urban house. With the help of Crassus, Caesar proposes, he can end all of Pompey's troubles. He can get Pompey's measures passed, if Pompey could rally his veteran soldiers and support Caesar in the elections for the consulship of 59. Well, Pompey has tried everything else. His soldiers deserve better. Rome deserves better. Something more honorable than this inefficient, invidious logjam being piled against him in the Senate. Pompey tells Caesar, "You've got yourself a deal." And Caesar adds, "Oh, by the way things have been going lately in the Forum, for everything to go smoothly, you might just want to keep your soldiers in town for, crowd control. Consider it a security measure. In fact, I insist on it." And Pompey knows what that means. But he's tried being the law and order man, the Constitution respecter for all this time. And where has it gotten him? Where has it gotten Rome? He tells Caesar, "We'll make that happen too." And Crassus then, as I imagine this secret scene, he smiles his gleaming smile, the billionaire smile, and he gets up and embraces Pompey. All that other stuff was behind them now. Crassus, of course, has some tricky measures that he wants rammed through as well. So they were now a triumvirate. Pompey knows, he fears even, that with their powers united, with Crassus's political network and his vast wealth, Caesar's popular charm, his consular authority, and his unmatched political skill, and Pompey's glory and his veterans and his own riches, which, provided that he retains his clientele among the eastern lands, could even be greater than Crassus's. Pompey knows the three of them can bend Rome to suit their will. They'll be unstoppable. And so they were. The political details of the year 59 we've already discussed in the life of Crassus, especially Part 2, Episode 72, and we'll treat other aspects in the life of Cato coming soon. Caesar is elected easily, and his colleague in office, predictably, was a hardliner optimate, a stalwart named Bibulus, who was a close associate of Cato the Younger. And in that year, there were riots and fist fights in the Forum, a bucket of manure dumped over Bibulus's head, filibuster upon filibuster. But the trio gets Pompey's legislation passed through one of his willing tribunes. Vatinius was his name. On top of Pompey's own goals, part of the deal was that Caesar himself would get voted his own extraordinary command. Rome's power at that time didn't penetrate very far into what's now France, then Gaul. They mainly controlled the coastal strip and some hinterlands. But there were wild tribes constantly threatening to overrun the border, at least in the Roman popular imagination. Caesar gets voted a 5-year unlimited command to deal with the alleged Gallic problem, a command to commence immediately after he leaves office at the end of the year. All this comes at a high cost. With all this rough riding over the usual constitutional procedures, the outrages against the authority of the Senate, the gangs of ex-soldiers forcing popular votes, intimidating honorable politicians, the good and the great among Rome's aristocracy are horrified. Even the plebs are shocked at the scale and the violence of the political rule-breaking. And as Caesar surely foresaw, it was not him nor Crassus, but Pompey, as the most recognizable big man in town, the conqueror, who ended up becoming the focal point of public anger, who gets accused of behaving like a king in their noble republic. Cicero, despite his frustration with Pompey, he hated to see his friend fall so steeply in the popular eye. As Cicero remarked in private to his friend Atticus, "Look at my soft-heartedness. I couldn't control my tears when I saw Pompey speaking at a public meeting on some of Bibulus's edicts. In the past, he used to play the gallery so magnificently from that rostrum, before an adoring crowd with everyone on his side. But this time he was humiliated, so downcast, so dissatisfied with himself. He has fallen from his rank among the stars, but it does look like an accident rather than his own fault." Pompey was losing noble supporters left and right. At last, he even lost Cicero. The 3 members of the cabal, the so-called First Triumvirate, at the beginning of it all, they had invited Cicero to join them, to help out, to be their spokesman, but he refused on principle. And he began railing against them in public, and he did direct all of his words against Caesar out of his respect for his friend Pompey. And as Cicero was threatening eventually to use his great influence to undo all of Caesar's consular legislation as soon as the year ended, well, Pompey tried to warn Cicero. He urged him to back down. But Caesar was in the end forced to let the populist dogs loose upon Cicero too. He and Crassus helped Clodius, that rakish young noble turned slumlord, to get elected tribune of the plebs. And at the beginning of the next year, after Caesar rides out to meet his new legions in Gaul, Clodius commences with a legislative onslaught on Cicero, and he ends up driving the orator into exile. And once again, the greatest loser in all of this, besides Cicero, was Pompey himself. Cicero was extremely popular with both the Senate and the plebs, and the most important equestrian business syndicates loved him too, and they all blamed Pompey for letting his friend down. And now with Caesar and Cicero both gone, Clodius gets even more confident. Clodius takes effective control of the Forum, with the mob of gangsters and ex-slaves that he keeps on his payroll. Clodius, by the way, was another political creation of Crassus, who financed all of his debts and bought off juries for him. There are people in this world who will smile at you and pat you on your back when they see you and even praise you when you're absent, but their loyalty is only to their own interests. And Pompey knew, triumvirate or not, his long-standing greatest rival at Rome, Crassus, was just such a man. And so when Clodius starts turning up the heat against Pompey, he knows who to blame, and that's Crassus. But Clodius was also coming into his own as an independent force in politics. I mean, he really didn't need any encouragement to pick a fight with somebody purely because they seemed strong and confident, purely because it would be fun. And whenever Pompey enters the city, he gets heckled and whistled at constantly. And he also feels shadowy eyes burning into him from behind dark corners. And he's got good intelligence that he should even be fearing for his life. And one day while he's on his way to the forum, someone drops a dagger near him with a loud clang. It's not so subtle a warning. After that, Pompey starts to really think about just giving up on politics. What did he have to prove to anyone at this point? He retires to his Alban villa to be among people who love him, who appreciate him and respect him. And meanwhile, Rome descends into further chaos. But Pompey has better things to focus on. Chief among them, he has a new wife. In the year of the triumvirate, 59, Caesar offered his only child, his lovely daughter Julia, in marriage to Rome's most eligible bachelor. It was a match made by Venus herself, you might say. Julia was only 18 years old at their marriage, 30 years younger than Pompey. But although the marriage began as a typical Roman political marriage, Pompey soon found himself genuinely smitten. Plutarch comments, "Indeed, the fondness of the woman for her husband was widely discussed, even though it seemed beyond the possibilities of their respective ages. The reason for it, however, seems to have lain in the chaste restraint of her husband, who knew only his wedded wife, and also in the dignity of his manners, which were not severe, but full of grace, and especially attractive to women, if we should not accuse Flora, the famous courtesan, of false testimony." End quote. Whenever Pompey was absent from important business in the Senate or the Forum, it was said that he was in his villas or his gardens, spending time with Julia. She had all the intelligence and beauty and feminine charm worthy of her father's ancient divine lineage. Pompey, after all of his trials, he'd earned the right to a little domestic bliss, hadn't he? But all this softness just encourages Clodius and his mobs to rampage even wilder in the city. Clodius gets Cato forcibly sent off on a long and unpleasant mission to the island of Cyprus, eliminating the last meaningful opponent who was standing in the way of his mob rule regime in Rome. And Pompey, he sees he just has too many people counting on him. He's got junior friends who are trying to advance their careers. He's got clients needing his help in the courts. He's got his honor to uphold, buildings to build, peace to keep, a legacy to secure. With the way things are headed, if he continues to rest, his enemies are going to steal away from him whatever favor he still has with the people. And since he's already long lost the Optimate nobles, where would that leave him? So Pompey orchestrates a counterattack to put young Clodius in his place. First, he collaborates with some of Cicero's supporters and engineers the recall of Cicero from exile to help somehow deal with the situation. After 18 months moaning in the backwaters of northern Greece, Cicero returns triumphant to Rome, crowds lining the roads and the city streets of Italy to cheer him on as he goes. Then, on his first day back, Cicero acknowledges the favor by proposing another extraordinary duty for Pompey. For a variety of reasons, grain prices in Rome have shot through the roof lately, and they've put a lot of pressure on the urban plebs, and this is causing a lot of panic in the streets. And, amazingly, with the full support of the Senate, and even the noblest establishment figures. Cicero has not a tribune, but this time one of the consuls for the year 57 pass a law appointing Pompey as Rome's first official praefectus annoni, the grain commissioner. It's a totally novel office. And I think that the support of the Senate there just shows the value of Cicero in politics. And this is a 5-year post, this prefect of the grain. It gives Pompey sweeping authority over all the Mediterranean once again, to organize the supply of imports from the bread baskets of Africa, Sardinia, Sicily, and anywhere else necessary in order to secure a steady supply and control prices. Pompey gets to work, traveling around, negotiating with farming syndicates, making deals with ship owners and grain traders, pulling all the necessary financing together, eliminating systemic inefficiencies. No man in Rome is better at this kind of thing than Pompey. He's swift, he's brilliant. Prices fall. The people warm back up to him again. Pompey's back. He performed his duties as grain commissioner, by the way, with that characteristic military spirit. One story sums this up well. He's about to set sail once to go to Sardinia or something, and there's this violent storm at sea, and the sea captains are saying, really, this is a little much, sir. But Pompey pushes them aside, and he leads his men up the gangplank, and he says to the captains, "To live is not necessary. To sail is necessary." And he orders them to weigh anchor and get to it. And he also finds at Rome a thug lord of his own, a former owner of a gladiator school named Milo. Milo organizes counter mobs and he hammers Clodius out of the forum, whatever it takes. Milo is deadly effective, and more on him in another series. And Pompey at this point is in a stronger domestic position than he's ever been. And for a brief moment there, in 57 and 56, it looks like the Republic might be on a path to stability. The Constitution is firmly in place, and Pompey's no dictator. He knows he has to make some sacrifices. For example, the king of Egypt, Ptolemy the Piper, comes to Rome on embassy after he's finally driven from his throne by the angry Alexandrians who hate him. And poor Ptolemy wants Pompey to reinstate him, and Pompey wants to be the man to do it too. Huge riches and prestige there, as we've noted. But the optimates have been softening towards Pompey a little lately. They're very clear, though, that they're firmly opposed to him meddling in Egypt. And so he drops the issue. It's not worth alienating them further over this. It's not worth overturning the Constitution. And yet, the mob is fickle, and so are the nobles. And Pompey soon finds himself itching for a new deal, because his grip is starting to slip a little. Crassus, for one thing, is a formidable behind-the-scenes challenger, as always. He's suborning Pompey's enemies here and there to work against him. So much so that Pompey even alleges to Cicero in private that Crassus is plotting against his life. Julius Caesar, meanwhile, is conducting a brilliant campaign in Gaul. His dispatches from the front lines come back reporting of stunning victories. In a few years, he's conquered practically the whole of modern France and Belgium. But predictably, this stirs up the nobles' resentment once again. And in the year 56, one of the most rich and cantankerous optimates, Domitius Ahenobarbus, is bragging about how he's going to get elected consul for 55 and he's going to strip Caesar of his illegal command. And, of course, take it for himself. Caesar's enemies are building momentum. And another long-standing foe of Caesar's, Cato the Younger, has finally returned from that annoying mission Clodius sent him on to Cyprus. And Cato has announced he's backing Domitius Ahenobarbus for the consulship, and that he himself will be running for the praetorship. Even Cicero is starting to get bold, and he's publicly entertaining the idea of undoing some of Caesar's land grant legislation, against his better judgment, in Pompey's opinion. And Pompey sees, well, his father-in-law is starting to become the neediest of the three erstwhile triumvirate partners. He's vulnerable so far away from Rome. Pompey could help with that. But he'd need to be reassured, of course. What would be in it for him? And so when Caesar and Crassus approach him to discuss another deal, which promises the possibility of shoring up Pompey's own position and getting Crassus and Clodius off his back, well, he's very receptive. And so in 56, the three of them have another meeting, this time at the city of Lucca in northern Italy, closer to Caesar's frontier. They invite some 200 out of the 600 total senators to be resident in the city, kind of mill around while the private council between the three great men goes on, and then to be the first to hear about how they could help out in the arrangement that was coming. And in a very telling sign of what was to come, Cicero and the other optimates were not invited. To make a long and painful story short, after the meeting, Pompey and Crassus announced their candidacy for the consulship of 55, another joint consulship between these two great rivals, and Caesar sends thousands of his troops home to vote for them in the elections. And Cato and Domitius Ahenobarbus mount a brave opposition. But on the election day, as they go down to the voting grounds early in the morning, they're met with a violent riot. Cato gets stabbed in the arm, Domitius gets beaten up, and his torchbearer even gets murdered. Domitius retreats home and effectively gives up on his consular campaign, and the electoral victory goes to Pompey and Crassus. Cato also finds himself bribed quite thoroughly out of a victory in the Praetorian elections. And Pompey didn't like these tactics. It was hard to call them honorable. But was it honorable to allow his father-in-law to fall as an unjust victim to the stubborn opposition of jealous nobles? It was important, too, that Rome be kept free from mob violence from men like Clodius, with a few necessary exceptions. Tribunes now once again are found to propose to the assembly the legislation that the three great men deemed necessary for the security of the Roman Empire. Caesar is voted another 5 years for his Gallic command. And Crassus feels like he's been too long in the shadow of his war-glorious colleagues, and he gets a 5-year proconsular command of his own to Rome's new province of Syria, where, arguably, the Parthians were threatening the border. Pompey himself is awarded a 5-year command in Spain. And they try to counteract some of this manhandling of Roman politics with a series of many law and order type legislations. For example, laws curbing bribery, ironically. But the overall impression of their unquestionable supremacy is impossible to hide. This time, though, much of the popular outrage against the magnates dictating terms to a cowed city seems to be falling on Crassus. In fact, in the middle of the year, Pompey finishes executing a long-laid plan to court the people over to his side permanently. The Greeks had been staging tragedies and comedies at least since the glory days of Athens in the 5th century BC, but for a long time the Romans resisted allowing this morally questionable habit that might distract them from their native specialty of martial excellence, so the censors would argue. But in the mid-200s BC, Rome finally made concessions, and since then they developed their own native tradition of drama and tragedy and comedy, led by early poets like Livius Andronicus, Ennius, and Plautus. However, they drew the line at constructing permanent stone theaters like those effete Greeks did. There were still revered laws on the books to prevent this sort of thing from ever happening. Before Pompey, as Tacitus later remarked, the games had usually been exhibited with the help of improvised tiers of benches and a stage thrown up for the occasion and taken down later. Or to go further into the past, the people stood to watch. Seats in the theater, it was feared, might tempt them to pass whole days in indolence. End quote. But when he returned from his eastern expeditions, Pompey bought a large tract of land on the Campus Martius outside the Pomerium and he set his builders to work. And now, at last, in 55, Pompey inaugurates a massive new stone complex. It was to all appearances a theater. However, at the very top tier of seats there was a little temple to Venus. So the vast semicircular edifice of seats were not seats at all, but temple steps, you could argue. What the Roman people might do with them was their business. And Pompey made it his business to open his new, let's be honest, theatrical complex with a massive production of games and contests and shows. 500 lions were brought in and pitted against gladiators, and all of them were used up over the course of 5 days, together with 18 African elephants. Cicero was a little squeamish, and he found the whole thing revolting, but he managed to sit through them and force a smile. But as Pompey listened to the shouts and acclamations of the 10,000 or so Romans in his new complex, shouts you could hear throughout the whole city, he took it as a clear sign that the people were firmly on his side once again. And the complex also featured elaborate gardens and shaded porticos. It was filled with paintings and ornate carvings, with benches for the populace to rest on and contemplate the muses while taking refuge from the summer heat. And there were statues that commemorated his victories, with a meeting hall large enough to accommodate the entire Senate. And near its entrance was a statue of Pompey himself as the victorious conqueror, so that the city's ruling classes would never forget how much he had done for Rome. The historian Cassius Dio wrote that in his day, 300 years later, this entire edifice was still an object of great pride for the city. It's true, Pompey's hopes of winning over the Optimates seemed to be pretty well dashed, but at this point he might ask himself, did he really need them after all? He was the grain commissioner, he was the builder of the theater, he was the conqueror, he was married to the best woman in Rome as far as he could tell. Even those who blamed him for his friendship with Caesar could not find fault with him for the love he felt for that exceptional woman. And what's more, she was pregnant with a child. At the end of his consular term, he left the city, but he left the management of his proconsular province of Spain to some of his talented subordinates. He and Julia stay, and they tour the fashionable resorts of Italy, meeting friends and well-wishers. Julia made him feel like a young man again, and his legacy seemed even more secure than ever. He'd grown greater than Sulla, unquestionably, and better too. Even Crassus was out of his hair for the foreseeable future, for his 5 years off to the east. Was it time, at last, to rest? But if crowds and noblemen are fickle, the gods are too. Early that fall, Julia, the sweetest prize he had ever won, died, giving birth to a baby girl, and the little girl died soon after her mother. The distraught Pompey makes arrangements to bury them both on the grounds of his Alban villa, but representatives of the people come to him and demand with tears that Julia be buried in state in the Campus Martius. Like her father, she was very popular with the urban crowds, and Pompey sinks into a deep depression. But the Romans, from the humblest trinket sellers to the Senate's backroom power players, for all their pity over his loss, they were even more alarmed at what this death might mean for the fate of the Commonwealth. For she was not just a lovely lady, but also the link that bound Pompey in a wary friendship with the man who was proving to be not just Rome's most talented politician, but perhaps her most talented general, too. But news was already on its way from the east that would shock them even further and throw into much more terrifying confusion the Republic's hopes for the future. That story will have to wait for episode 3. Thanks for listening to The Cost of Glory. Stay strong, stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.